So thank you so much, everyone, for staying so late with us. I will start the session 4, and in that session, we want to learn about how we can learn in the adaptive management context. So summary of the previous episodes. So far, we've assumed that we were able to characterize the dynamics of a system. So in the breakout sessions, you add transition probabilities that would allow you to do that, okay? But in the adaptive management context, in many domains, we actually do not have access to the dynamics of that probability of transition you were playing with during the exercise. But we still need to make decisions, so that's our challenge. And this is why we use adaptive management in that context. So adaptive management provides a solution of making decisions when we don't have access to these probability transitions. So adaptive management is learning by doing. So in the way Walters and Hilborn define it, they say that the principle of adaptive management is that decisions are selected to achieve a management objective. So this is why in my little graph here, the objective is actually what drives the way we would manage, monitor, and learn, while simultaneously gaining information to improve future management outcomes. Okay, so the things that are important, we do need to have a management objective, and we're interested in finding the best decisions to improve our future management outcomes. And that requires learning. All right. So before I go too much into the details of how we would learn in the adaptive management context, there are some main questions to address. Just to make sure that you actually have an adaptive management problem. So what we would assume here is that you've been able to define an objective, the actions, and you have an ability to monitor outcomes over time. So you can get some signal over whether or not you're going into the right directions. And you are uncertain about the system dynamics. So we don't have access to that probability transitions that we work with in the MDP context. If it's not the case, then it's kind of good news. It is not an adaptive management problem, or bad news. It depends what you're interested in. But if you have all of these components, this next step is actually about identifying the type of structural uncertainty. So Paul introduced a different type of uncertainty, and adaptive management is suited for structural uncertainty. And so the question then is like, can you identify an uncertain variable that drives the dynamics? So often we know a little bit about the dynamics, but we don't have complete information. And that's really is bothering us. If you don't have uncertain variables, then again, it is not an adaptive management problem. So you can potentially solve a Markov decision process simply. You don't need to include the unknown variable into the system. If you have this uncertain variable, then you can look into what type of, we can go deeper into the type of structural uncertainty and look at what type of uncertainty you really have. Is it a parameter that you are uncertain about, or several parameters, or are you uncertain about what we call models? And I will define that later. So parameter or model uncertainty is the next stage. So let's go into these two types of uncertainty I talked about. So my way of representing an adaptive management problem with an influence diagram is this way. We have a state at time t, and state at time t+1. We can make some decisions or actions, and that's something we don't know. That's our uncertainty, and that actually affects our ability to reach the next state. And without that ability, it's hard. If we want to optimize our objective, we need to find the best. And we need to find the best decision. It's hard to reach our objective. So as I said, there's two types of uncertainty. Parameter uncertainty. Here are some examples. A survival rate, a growth rate, or probability of success is what we call, when we don't know what these values are, we call that parameter uncertainty. And so they're important because they influence our transition matrices from state at time t to state at time t+1, given an action we could perform. And the other type of uncertainty is what we call model uncertainty. So in that case, the main difference here is model uncertainty are more like broad scenarios, or they correspond to different hypotheses about how a species of a system would respond. So typically on the sea level rise, we're unsure about whether or not shorebirds population would actually be able to fly further to a next patch of habitat. Another type of model uncertainty could be expert opinions. So when you don't have a lot of data, you just have to rely on your experts to provide these transition matrices, and often these experts don't necessarily agree. Another type of model uncertainty are population dynamics. So now I'm going to try something and see if in the room, in the chat function, we can have examples of uncertain information for the system or attendees may have. Do you have other examples that fit in that? And I can't really see somehow I can't see the chat, so that's annoying.
I'll read out from the chat if we get something in there. Okay.
So yesterday breakout session, we talked about the problem people work on, and we had different examples. So I'm just gonna talk about Brian, for example, if he doesn't contribute. So Brian had a frog problem, and in his context, it was very unclear when how to manage. So the probability of success of management was completely unknown. So that would be some kind of parameter uncertainty problem. Do we have another example, or should I just keep giving the examples of yesterday's? So Anna had a climate change example. So from her perspective, so climate change, we have several scenarios, and we can that would fall into the category of model uncertainty. So it's a little bit like sea level rise, except that we have climate change scenario. All right. I'll go to the next slide. Okay, next slide. So we've gone through the type of uncertainty, and then to know if we really have an adaptive management problem, the other things we need to check is whether or not we need adaptive management. So we have some uncertain variables that seem to bother us. But to be really sure that we need adaptive management, we need to do what we call a value of information. So the question is, will reducing the uncertainty provide a greater outcome? And so Mike yesterday touched on that. And what it means is that if your optimal strategy does not change when you reduce the uncertainty, then you shouldn't be bothered doing an adaptive management problem. You can just solve the Markov Decision Process as we did. And you can take an average model, for example. But if it has a value of information, so then if reducing that uncertainty does change the outcome, then the problem can be solved using adaptive management. And I would like to differentiate two types of adaptive management approach you may use. The adaptive management approach that we call active adaptive management, we talked about before. And it is, in our area, it is the best way of solving an adaptive management problem. But we also acknowledge that in some cases, it doesn't bring much to be active. And the passive adaptive management approach could be a good solution too. So I'm going to talk about that next. So let's redefine these two ways of solving adaptive management problem. So passive adaptive management provides the best actions given our current knowledge, but learning occurs independently. So this is my adaptive management little diagram. These are all the things we need to do. And the way we learn is by using Bayes. And the way we optimize is by using stochastic dynamic programming, and that's Bellman. And so when we do the passive adaptive management, what happens is that we do not include the learning into the optimization, right? So it's a heuristic. It's easier to solve because we don't have to think about the optimal way of learning over time and how it would change our decision, okay? In optimal control, it's often called certainty equivalence principle, and it's used when the system is basically too complex to do everything at once. And the active adaptive management approach provides the best actions given our current knowledge and what we will learn into the future. So this time, in our stochastic dynamic approach, or MDPs, we have to include the way our learning will occur. So it's much harder. So it is optimal, but it's difficult to solve. So tomorrow we will see, we'll go into the details of how to include the learning into the stochastic dynamic programming approach. And today we'll focus into just the learning part, different ways of learning. It's our first step towards that. So we can optimize the way we perform adaptive management or learning by doing, but how we will do that. So the things we need to know is represent our current knowledge, and we need to learn. And the way I present this aspect of adaptive management, it's about choosing what we call a sufficient statistic and being able to update that sufficient statistic. Okay. So adaptive management problems differ from our classic Markov decision process, that or stochastic dynamic programming approach, because the value of a parameter or model, so because that's the type of uncertainty or structural uncertainty we have, is hidden from the decision maker. So we have this like variable here, but we don't have access to it, but we know it influences our next states and the efficiency of our management action. The value of a parameter of a true model influences the dynamic of the system ST and the best action. So that's what I just said. Therefore, to actually act optimally in that system, what we need is come up with an optimal policy. So I call that P star, but in the Mike and Paul use A star. P star, it's because my background is in computer science and artificial intelligence, and we use pi or P, pi, I guess. The optimal policy depends on both the observable state variable, ST, and the value of a hidden variable, but we don't have access to that hidden variable. So that's our issue. How can we act optimally? We design that optimal policy. And this is where we use sufficient statistics. So the value of a hidden variable must be estimated using the history of observations and actions. So because we don't have access to YT, but we have access to ST, a way of estimating how much we know is to actually track the history of state action over time to find out what the next best action is. And this is not convenient because you can imagine that that's a lot of information we need to remember, and we can't really code that. No one wants to do that. So because it is not feasible to remember the complete past history of observation or of observation and action, we use sufficient statistics. And so there's a lot of work that has been done on sufficient statistics. Here, I will just give you the idea that sufficient statistics allow us to retain data without losing any important information. So we want something that summarizes all of that and that is easy to code. So here are the desirable properties of sufficient statistics, because that sufficient statistics will be included in our optimal policy. To be useful in adaptive management, they must obey the Markov property. This is because we are in the Markov decision model world. They have to be easy to represent. And when we say represent, is like we need, it's also from a computational perspective and modeling perspective. And they have to be easy to update. And this is also just to be efficient computationally and mathematically, and for interpretation purpose too. So finding sufficient statistics that best represent uncertain variable is a central and long-standing challenge of adaptive management. And funny enough, in that seminal book, Walters, 1986, on adaptive management, this was already an issue and it hasn't changed. But we've made a lot of progress with Bayesian statistics. And so now we have a lot of guidance to do that well. So that's good news for you and for everyone here. Okay, so sufficient statistics are what we will be using, but we need to define them. What do they represent? And to do that, to define them well, we first need to think about the type of hidden variables that are that we don't know and that we need to represent and get an estimate on. And the important information to pick a good sufficient statistic that guides the decision about finding the sufficient statistic is to find out whether are hidden variables that influence our transitions probabilities. Is that, are they finite or infinite? Do they take finite or infinite number of values? So here's an example. So for survival rate, it's usually, they can take infinite values. Everything that is a rate, usually as, it's a percentage or it's a 1 point something. For probability of success, we also have infinite values between 0 and 1. But when we look at model uncertainty and competing scenarios, sea-level rise, expert opinion, for example, these hidden variables take finite values. So we have very discrete choice. And that's the type of information we'll be using. So as a summary, if you have if you're in the case of parameter uncertainty, it's likely that your parameter will take infinite number of values. If you're in the model uncertainty world, it's likely that this hidden variable, that is your model, will take finite number of values, could take finite number of values. And of course, all of that is in the modeling world. So we'll see that we can, if we discretize, there are techniques to turn an infinite number of values, hidden variable, into a finite number of values. So we can go from one to the next. And that's what I want to. So now that we've established that the fact that our hidden variables is finite or infinite is important, we can, for choosing a sufficient statistic, we can go into each of these case study. So when a hidden variables take finite values, we can use sufficient statistic that we call belief states. Belief states are widely used I'd say in most papers in artificial intelligence, that's what people use. In many papers in the adaptive management world, this is what is used to. So belief states are probability distribution over finite quantities. And of course, they can be used. We can be updated using Bayes theorem, and we'll see that in the next slide. So here are some examples. The different domains. So this is just a short list, but to give you an idea of what they represent. So in that paper, in the sustainable harvest domain by Williams, the objective was to maximize long-term cumulative harvest of waterfowl above a certain density threshold. So that's the most famous, I'd say, example of application of adaptive management to date. And in that paper, they had two alternative models of population response to harvest and survival. Right. In another paper by Moore et al., it's a conservation problem. They try to maximize the time discounted plant population size across years without burning, and they use two models describing juvenile plant stage response to burning. And in that problem would be our little Zoom example. It's a climate change problem from Sam Nicol, who's in my lab. The objective is to maximize migratory shorebirds populations across space, and they're subject to sea level rise, and it's not sea level rise, but sea level rise. And in that case, the belief states are over three models representing alternative responses to management under sea level rise. So to give you an idea of what these belief states represent, we're just going to have a little zoom on an application. So the problem is adaptive management of habitat for migratory shorebirds. So they fly from north to south every year, back and forth, and the habitat in between is actually subject to sea level rise. So the coastal habitat that we see here is likely to get flooded under sea level rise. What's uncertain, and we have about, I think, 15 species of migratory birds that are threatened by that loss of habitat. What's uncertain to managers is where we should invest in habitat management under sea level rise. So it's likely that this bird will lose their habitat, and it's already occurring just because of development. But sea level rise, we want to make sure that we don't make investment that that won't be useful when, or that could be useful in the long term, including sea level rise. So it's a very interesting flow diagram network. So if you work on flow network, or you have for a population, if you lose one of the habitat along the way, then you're losing the proportion of a population that was using that network or habitat. So you won't get it back into the breeding when they have to breed. So you're losing an entire portion of a population. So it's very important to get it right. So the way Sam and the team model the states, they represented the breeding population. So that's my influence diagram here. And the things we're uncertain about, our model uncertainty, are the consequences of sea level rise. And I won't go too much into the details, but as you know, climate change means that the sea level rise considered may change over time. So we might start at 0 meter, and then at some stage, we don't know when, the consequences would be perhaps 1 meter or 2 meters, and we don't know when. So what's unknown is not necessarily the sea level rise itself, it's the consequences of how the population of these birds population would have, is the consequences of sea level rise on this bird population. So we know we're going to lose habitat. What we don't know is whether or not they'll be able to fly further and find another spot or not. So that's what Sam was trying to find out. So in that case, the belief state to start with could be a uniform belief state. So that means we have a belief of 1/3 over the population. And then as we get more information about the sea level rise, we can be more precise. So in that case, we are more confident that we have a 0 meter sea level rise consequence on the bird population. And so see if you can get that. So that should sum to 1, and there's a typo here. It doesn't sum to 1, so it's not a good example. So this should be probably 0.6, 0.4, 0. Or 0, something like that. And that's a good example of don't do that. Okay, so that belief here represents the probability. It's a probability distribution over the finite elements of or hidden variables. So we have a probability over 0, 1 meter, 0 meter, 1 meter, and 2 meters. And to give you, in the context of the application, we would update this probability distribution over time as we get more information about the response of a system and we manage the system. So this is what these lines represent here. Okay, so we talked about belief states, and we know that they're convenient to use as sufficient statistics when we have a finite number of values for hidden variable. What we will learn now is how we update them, and so how we will learn over time. And so we use Bayes rule for that. And so we have our usual posterior here, or prior PV, and the likelihood PAV. And so in the context of adaptive management, this is what it means. So our belief at time t+1 that model Y is more likely depends on the states we are in at time t, the action we perform at time t, the state we observe at time t+1, and our previous belief at time t. And we can calculate that by by evaluating this whole equation here. And so Py st plus 1 st80 is like the state transition probability, assuming that the true model is y. So this is like this little thing index here. And this is given either by your simulation or models or experts. So you have access to that information. What you don't know is which one of these y is actually the true y, right? BT represent the probability that y best describe the system dynamics at time t here. All right, and that's our normalizing factor. Okay, so what can I say? This is quite easy to calculate. You have all the elements usually when you define your adaptive management problem, so there's nothing to worry about here. From a computational perspective, often we just calculate the first term here, and we don't worry about the denominator because we can get that information. It's just faster not to calculate the denominator. All right. So summarizing. Why are we going through defining whether or not we should care about finite values or infinite values? This is because it will influence the way you would actually solve active adaptive management problems. Okay, so the question to help you decide which optimization approach to perform and which sufficient statistic to use is linked to that. Does the uncertain variable, parameter, or model take finite number of values? If it's yes, that's what we've seen so far, then we will augment the state space with the sufficient statistic belief states. And once we've done that, we are able to solve either active adaptive management problem using what we will see tomorrow is a different type of MDP that is called a belief MDP, but we will discretize and go back to what we've done today with our breakout session. Or what we will see on Friday is you can solve a POMDP. I think it's Friday for me, it might be Thursday for you. The alternative is to solve a passive adaptive management problem. So we've seen one branch, but it turns out that it's not always the case. We do get some no's, we do get some infinite number of values. And so in that case, we need to define a sufficient statistics that fits that case. So for problems with hidden variables that take infinite values, so think about a probability of management success, for example. Sufficient statistics that take, yeah, sorry, I forgot that. Yeah, so, oops, yeah, I forgot to update that. Don't look at that. Let's go back. For problems with hidden variables that take infinite values, we need to ask a second question. Can the history of observation and action be represented using a sufficient statistic? So are you able to find in the literature a way of finding a sufficient statistic? And if you can't, then our recommendation is to actually discretize your uncertain variables into finite number of values. This is because it's easier to go back to something that is finite. And so you go back into that finite way of solving the problem. So if you have a priority management success, you could if you can't find a sufficient statistic that you like, which is unlikely, but if it's the case, then you can just discretize the potential values of a probability of management success by range of 0.1, and you go back into that nice or easier way of solving adaptive management. If you can find a sufficient statistic, then you need to ask yourself, does the sufficient statistic take finite values? So there's another step where when you look at your finite, when you look at sufficient statistic, can you represent it using additional variables that only take finite values? So it's a bit tricky, but if you're able to do that, then good news, because you can solve an active adaptive management problem using MDPs. If you can't, if if your sufficient testing doesn't take finite values, then you may, I say you may because it becomes quite advanced approaches, and we'll talk about that in the last day. You may have to discretize the values of your sufficient statistics, so you can go back in something finite, basically. So if you'd guess the whole thing to come up with solving an MDP, an adaptive management as an MDP, is at some stage we have to approximate so that it's make some approximations, simplify the problem so that we end up into something that is finite. So that's the story with that slide. But now we need to talk about that part of a decision diagram. Let's look into finding sufficient statistics when we are able to we have to deal with infinite number of values. Yeah, and I forgot to say, but at any stage, if it's too hard, you can go back to solving passive adaptive management problem, and that's fine. And that works too. Okay, for infinite values, we again use Bayes' rule, and we have to find a way of representing our hidden variable. So the distribution BT of theta is the continuous parameter of the infinite, the hidden variable that takes infinite values. Represent the values of parameter theta at time t as a probability density function, and we do call that belief in theta in some cases. So it gets a bit confusing. Belief states, belief in theta, different. So something you need to be aware of. So observing the system response to management action between times t and t+1 provides information that can be used to update this belief. And again, we use Bayes' theorem to update that distribution. So it might be straightforward for some of you, but this is the same equation, except that this time we're in the continuous domain. So all of these parameters you would have access to, so nothing to worry about most of the case. Well, no, that's not true. It's actually quite challenging. In some cases, it can be easy, and in some cases, it can be challenging. And the next slide will explain the cases where it can be more challenging. So the belief at time t+1 in theta depends again on our state at time t, or action that we perform at time t, the observation we got for time t+1, where we ended up, and our previous belief at time t. And we can calculate that using p theta st+1 st, and that's the state transition probability, assuming that the true parameter value is theta, and our previous belief beta. Okay, so the whole challenge here is to find sufficient statistics for bt theta when we can have conjugate priors. So that can be, as I said, that can be challenging to calculate. But if we can find if BT is a conjugate prior for P theta, then we have a lot of complexity. A lot of the complexity is actually gone, and so a lot of research has looked into that. And one of the most, the simplest way of looking into it is actually assuming that the parameter follow a beta distribution with binomial updating. So these are some examples that you can look into, and reference will be provided. Well, let's have a closer look. So that in conservation forestry, McCarthy and more, they looked at maximizing the expected number of successes over a specified number of time periods. The uncertain parameter was a probability of success of management action, and they define it as the beta distribution with binomial updating. In fishery example by Cindy Arthur, the objective is to maximize long-term fish stock harvest, and the unknown parameter is recovery rate, again, beta distribution with binomial updating. Another example, conservation of translocation. Translocation of threatened species to 2 different sites. It's a little bit more complex, but basically the mortality rate was the uncertain parameter. And again, they use some beta distribution with binomial updating. So if you want to, what are the key elements? And then David will be our will do a zoom on an application. The uncertain parameter P here is in 0, 1, so that's a management success or a rate. There's uncertainty surrounding P, and it's okay to represent it as a beta distribution, so it's an assumption that is made. And then we're able to update that beta distribution. And so I won't go too much into the details right now because David is about to present how it works. What is important here to remember is that now the optimal policy will depend on the sufficient statistics and the size of a population or your state that you can observe. Mike, are you able to? No, sorry, David, are you able to take over?
Yeah, let me, no, you got to stop your share, turns out. So let me share my screen. People should be seeing fields of grain, and now they should be seeing my my slide here. And so, yeah, I'm gonna cut in briefly to provide an illustration with the beta binomial model. So we're gonna suppose that we have an uncertain success rate for a process. This to kind of I'm having to abuse notation here slightly for reasons I'll explain in a minute, and go with S bar for that. And let's say we observe k successes. In a 0, 1 process with 0 failure, we have k times that the trials turn up with a value of 1 from capital Z trials. And we assume we have a beta prior over the true value of S bar, which is between 0 and 1. And we can summarize that with hyperparameters, alpha and beta. And hyperparameters, that label is often used to distinguish these belief parameters from underlying physical, economic, what have you, parameters of the process model. And it turns out, because of this convenient property of conjugacy, that if you start out with a beta belief characterized by alpha and beta, then after observing Z trials and k successes, that your posterior belief is also beta. So it's not guaranteed to work out that way if you have different likelihood for the data if it's not binomial and your prior is not beta. It's a special property of these densities that works out to where your hyperparameters that are updated for your posterior that I'm referring to with the plus notation from before take this form where you add the number of successes onto alpha, and then you add the number of trials less successes onto beta. And this conjugacy is very convenient for numerical modeling of sequential belief updating, this property of conjugacy. And that's why, as Iadine alluded to, it's when you can incorporate into your model as a reasonable assumption, there's a lot of incentive to do so for the numerical convenience. So I'm going to provide 2 examples of a prior that is centered around S bar equals 0.5 in both cases. And in both cases, you have 10 trials, just to pick some arbitrary numbers here. If you only observe 1 success, notice that your beliefs shift to lower values of the probability of success, but you don't snap immediately to a very low value, even when you only observe 1 success. There's some property of sluggishness of the adjustment. And similarly, on the flip side, when you have lots of success out of 10 trials based on your prior, you adjust towards a centering probability over higher values of S bar, but it's similarly not a automatic adjustment to a very high S bar value. So a lot of my view of this session in the material Iadine put together is really about setting up for tomorrow and the last day of the tutorial, a couple different looks about how we incorporate models of beliefs into structured decision problems. And so to set that up, I'm going to take one of Mike's papers and that deals with beliefs about an uncertain growth parameter essentially in a population model. And I'm going to pose a very simple version of his model. And I'm going to talk more about it on the fourth day. So I'm going to assume to start out no harvest, and then a population, capital N, produces Z juveniles each period as some fraction of the number of adults. And then this model assumes that as a source of noise in population dynamics, that the number of surviving juveniles is the outcome of a binomial process. So you have, I needed to put the floor function in there so that it's a whole number for this to go through. But you have for roughly the number of juveniles, those are the trials, and the number of surviving juveniles is a draw from this density K. And it's a draw, you know, underlying the dynamics, it's based on the true probability of survival for each trial S bar. But that's not observed. As Iadine was saying, we don't have access to that directly. Instead, we're going to maintain beta beliefs over it. And then just to close out how defining the model, that draw of surviving juveniles is plugged into a Beverton-Holt type stochastic difference equation. So if that's making sense, what I did here just to illustrate not only a simple example, but how this can work in dynamic models, what I did is I coded up this simple version of Mike's setup, again with no harvest, and I'll talk more about other simplifications I made, and I simulated what's going on. So on the left-hand side, I thought it'd be easier to just show juveniles generated each period and then surviving juveniles. So that's going to, the relationship between the blue and the pink line is going to be stochastic. I kind of had a bit of a burn-in period, if you will, to so after initializing it, you're seeing after time step 3, I'm assuming that this is a rebuilding stock from 10 abundance of 10. It's going to be growing from there based on the other biological parameters. And I'm using the same prior the same prior for the full dynamic chain of realizations, but the same initial belief, you could say, that I illustrated a moment ago just with the densities. And the true S bar value that's not observed, we're learning about it from observing surviving juveniles, is going to be 0.8. And so I'm just going to step forward here to see, how this goes. So we observe more juveniles surviving, our beliefs adjust. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing the mean, I should have said I'm showing the mean of the beta belief, and then a 90% confidence interval for around that mean. And then we can step forward again, observing more surviving juveniles. Again, keep going, kind of a movie, and I think you can just make it out. The confidence interval is narrowing slightly, and we're converging over time to getting closer to the true level of the true S bar value. But it's a process of adjustment. It doesn't happen right away. And I'll wrap up by saying that it's not an automatic adjustment. The beliefs adjust much more rapidly, as you might expect when you have a higher population with more juveniles, more trials being generated. And I'll get into, on the last day, extensions of this model to capture more realistic uncertainty around the growth process in this case. But I thought this simple illustration did a good job for showing how beliefs and physical state variables can co-evolve in a model together. So
That's
I'll
great.
turn it back over to you.
Thank you. That's exactly what we needed. So I hope that helps understanding the process of updating sufficient statistic in the case that it's continuous. Of course, we focus on simple examples. What you need to know is that there are a lot of examples in the literature, or you can make your own, of different type of discrete conjugate distributions and sufficient statistics that you could potentially use in adaptive management parameter. And here I just put like an example of some of these that we got from our review paper. So that's for the discrete conjugate distribution, but we also have some continuous conjugate distributions that could be used potentially. And of course, it can become quite complex. All right, so I won't go into the details of any of that. So now I'd like to do some reflecting back and about what we've presented today. So in the adaptive management setting, we do have to learn so that we improve over time the way we manage our system. So today we focus on learning uncertain quantities using sufficient statistics, and depending on whether or not you are in the model uncertainty world or parameter uncertainty world, so you have a choice of sufficient statistic that could be used. And we've looked into how we can update this sufficient statistic using Bayes. To find the optimal adaptive management strategy, we will have to augment the state space with the sufficient statistics and then solve stochastic type of stochastic dynamic programming approach. And that's what we will focus on tomorrow. Okay. Talking about tomorrow, we have 2 sessions. Session 5 will focus on the left side of this decision tree. So I will be explaining solving adaptive management under model uncertainty. So that's let's say when we have discrete. No, I think it's on the model uncertainty. So that's the left side of this decision tree. In session 6, Paul will go through solving adaptive management under parameter uncertainty and more advanced ways of solving it. And so that's the other side of that decision tree. I hope that was useful. I've put a lot of information and references into these slides, and I need to acknowledge the co-authors that have helped me learn about ways of solving an adaptive management problem, and all the references can be found on that paper. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, now is the right time. Maybe just I'll ask a question to Paul. Paul, did I do an okay job?
Yes.
Absolutely. From my point of view, you did.
There is a question here in the Q&A that says, give us a concrete definition of a sufficient statistic.
So this sufficient statistics have been defined by, they go back to Fisher. I don't have a concrete definition of sufficient statistic except that it's defined, and I was looking for a definition actually when I was writing the adaptive management review. It's defined by its usefulness rather than what it is, so it's a bit vague, and I wasn't happy with that. So I went with, but I'm just gonna open the room.
Yeah, can I give an example? So just from the recent application that Dave gave, there was this beta binomial model where you have this, suppose the thing that we're uncertain about is the weight of a given coin. And you could think of that coin as a stand-in for, say, some success or failure process that happens each period. In each period, you observe a flip of that coin, and sometimes it comes up heads, sometimes it comes up tails. And let's just call that like a success versus a failure. So if you're using a beta distribution to model those beliefs, then it turns out that each time you flip the coin, if it's a success, you update one of the parameters of that beta distribution by 1. You move it, say, from 2 to 3 or 3 to 4. Or if there's a failure, you just add a 1 to the other parameter. So those two parameters, in some sense, those are capturing the sufficient statistics over time of that coin flipping process that are all summarized in the two parameters of that beta distribution. There is that long run stream of successes and failures, but they're all embedded in those two parameters of the beta distribution that fully describe your current beliefs based on the entire previous history.
If you want a definition of sufficient statistic, it's essentially that if you look at the likelihood of the data, the likelihood can be represented with all of the data itself, but it can also be represented exactly in terms of the sufficient statistics. So that we don't need the history, all we need is the sufficient statistic. And besides the beta, a simple example is if the data is generated under a normal distribution, then the mean and the sample mean and sample variance completely represent the likelihood of that data. We don't need the individual observations. We just need the mean, the sample mean and sample variance to express the likelihood of the data.
So I guess it's about capturing all information that is required in our case to make a decision, and there's different ways of doing that depending in the context of adaptive management, whether you have a finite, with hidden variables take finite values or infinite values. I hope that helps.
It should be pointed out, of course, that the sufficient statistics depend on the assumed likelihood of the data. So if we know that it's normal, then we can use sample mean and variance. But if we don't actually know if it's normal, then we would essentially be better off with the history of the data, with all of the data, because then we could do statistical inference with other probability distributions than the normal. So sufficient statistics really are a combination of, I shouldn't say a combination, but they're tied to a particular assumption about how the data is generated.
Was that helpful? Any comments about, do you see yourself using, what type of sufficient statistic do you think you'll be using, infinite or finite values, something like that for your case studies?
We have a question from Anonymous. What is an example of a case with parameter uncertainty?
David,
you muted yourself.
Oh, my bad. I have these call center headphones and I pressed the button accidentally. So where we're not able to get a finite number of sufficient statistics.
We're actually going to talk a little bit about that. I don't know if David or Mike is the discussant on the projection approach, but there are cases where the posterior that we get is not of the same form as the prior. And in those cases, we may not have a sufficient statistic that we can use. Or you could say that there's a sufficient statistic, but it's infinite dimensional, so that's not very helpful. But we can use the projection approaches that we'll talk about on day 4 in that case. And those are approximate methods rather than exact.
There's also, Charles has a question.
Yeah, Charles has written, if the data is characterized by fat tails, can we use the scale and shape parameters of a generalized Pareto distribution as sufficient statistics? I'm not quite sure what the generalized Pareto distribution, I'm not quite sure what that is offhand and how many, and what the parameters are of that distribution. In general, though, I should say that when we have exponential distributions, so distributions from the exponential family, they will have conjugates. There'll be some conjugate prior likelihood combination. So if we had a fat-tailed exponential distribution, there would be likely to be a conjugate prior for that.
Right, I think that's right, and I think a lot of these questions seem to be riffing a bit off of the case we have a continuous uncertain parameter, and that is going to be a subject for day 4, as Paul said. I think that there are a small collection of models that have this nice conjugate property. Many of them are quite useful for applied work, but that property is easy to break. And I think that's why there's been a lot of interest recently in having more flexible modeling approaches that work okay, even when you can't guarantee that conjugacy will be there.
So let me just add. So Dr. Sims, first of all, it's good to see you joining us. Charles Sims is a friend of the family, so nice to see you chime in. And just to connect Charles's question, which is, suppose your beliefs are given by a Pareto distribution. Is there some sort of sufficient statistic process, way that this will all work out? And it depends on the likelihood of the data that you're observing. So if you look, you can do Google searches or look up various references, but what you want to look for is the relationships. So say your beliefs are Pareto, what sort of data generating process has a conjugate relationship with that? And it turns out that that's, if your data is coming from a uniform distribution between 0 and some level theta, then observing draws from that, you can then model the beliefs using Pareto, and everything's conjugate, and the parameters of that Pareto distribution will be your state variables that will be those sufficient statistics, just like the beta binomial was in the example that David gave.
I think it'd be good if you explain conjugacy and the way you view it, because I think in mathematics there's kind of different words meaning that thing. So can you explain when you say that property?
Well, in short, it just means if your beliefs follow a certain distribution to start with. So suppose we have beliefs about the weight of a coin that are given by a beta distribution. It just means that after we make our observation and we update our beliefs, our posterior is also of the same distribution. It's also a beta distribution,
Oh, I see. Okay.
but updated in some sense to move depending on what you've observed. So this conjugacy just means your prior is of the same form as your posterior.
I got it.
So
Okay.
they're both, say, beta, or they're both Pareto.
Okay, thank you.
And what that allows us to do is update these hyperparameters that David was talking about. So the prior will have some hyperparameters, and when we combine that with data, we'll get new hyperparameters, but for the same functional form.
Why do you use that word hyperparameters? What did you mean by
Well,
that?
it's to distinguish between the parameters of the system. So you may have parameters that define a transition equation or transition matrix or whatever. Those are system parameters. And we could call them belief parameters, but it's common to refer to them as hyperparameters,
I see. Okay,
at
good.
least in
Okay,
certain literatures.
I got it. Okay, thank you.
So there's a question here on the Q&A that says, the assumption of the Markov property does not seem appropriate for, oh, somebody just answered that and it just
My
went
bad.
away.
If you go to answered, we can pull it
Yeah.
up. I
got it. So the assumption of a Markov property does not seem appropriate for systems that exhibit delays in response to management. Is there a way to get around that?
So that's
talked
completely
about
true.
that. Go ahead, Iadine. go ahead.
Yes, so I have a slide on that, and it's completely true. Delay is an issue. So think about the restoration project where you're planting trees and you want to measure the benefit to conservation. It will take a long time for the habitat to be restored. And so, yeah, that's a massive Markov, maintaining the Markov property for this type of problem is a massive issue. So what we tend to do is include several states from different time step into that, but that generates even more complexity. So yeah, it's a research from my perspective, it's a research problem. It's exactly the type of limitations that we have to face.
I would add that day 4 content will be of interest to people worried about this, because it's going to touch on what to do about larger models with more state variables that are called for to deal with, as one solution to deal with this and get Markov dynamics back by tracking more state variables.
In the wrap up of day 1 that I did this evening, I included a slide from Mike, which asked that discussion question of what you do when you have delays in the state, for instance. So the future state might depend on the current state and last period state. And the simple answer is that we include last period state as a state variable. So we keep track of more than one period in the state vector, and that makes it Markov. So that's the simple answer, and that would be how you would handle this kind of delayed response problem. But as David points out, it makes the problem bigger. So we may get into cursive dimensionality problems if we do that.
And so maybe someone wants to comment on the sufficient statistic part. So I think we've addressed the how to account for delay in the state variable, but not so much in the sufficient statistic part. David, so basically, yeah. Do you see the difference? I feel like so far we've addressed the question from just this augmenting the state space with more state variables for previous time period, but we haven't addressed the sufficient statistic part.
Oh, okay. So like I'm sorry. So you don't get information right in the same time step, and so you're updating. Is the idea you're updating using measurements from like a long time ago, or maybe I'm not understanding.
Well, I feel like it would be this. We'll have to incorporate the updating of a sufficient statistic with the information we have, and it might be just harder.
What we'll do is let me think about this one. I'll chat with Iadine and see if I can dig anything up about the issue of delay, honing in on the belief updating itself, because I think I may need to think about that
So
for a while.
just to maybe try to paint an example, suppose, to play off Iadine's example of a delay that she talked about, suppose you wanted to understand the relationship between how many trees you planted in an area and the increase in the species richness that you then found, say 15 years later. Mm-hmm. Well, what you'd have to do is, first of all, you have to have your model of how you're going to learn what relationship you want to draw. And so in this case, it's the relationship between how many trees were planted in 15 years ago, and then what is the species richness today. So that's the relationship you're trying to understand. And this is giving you one observation of that. And so what you'd have to do is keep track as a state variable how many trees you planted 15 years ago, and you'd have to hold on to that until you got to today in order to then extract the information of, I planted 15 trees and now I've got this much species richness, and this is what it tells me about the relationship between trees and species richness, given this density of trees that I planted. So as the others have alluded to, it typically means expanding your state space and holding on to variables for a longer period than you would otherwise tend to do.
I'm going to riff on this. Just one more thing that may be relevant is that you can also often a problem may call for forming expectations about things like far in the future, and so you can sequentially project forward multiple steps with your model and your belief state. So if the delay is coming from maybe there's a connection here. If the delay is coming or is rooted in, I need to make decisions about something far in the future that I may not find out about based on information today, you can do more than one step ahead projection of what your belief dynamics look like with your model, with say the beta binomial model we had. So that could be relevant here too. But my instincts are to agree with Mike, is that a lot of times the answer is to augment the state space, but we'll keep talking about it and see if there's another wrinkle here that we could also talk about.
Is anyone aware of a paper that has tried to do that, or a problem that has tried to develop an adaptive management approach when we had delayed in response of a system? I'm not aware of it.
I was involved in some work that's somewhat related to this. We were looking at the management of mallard ducks in the U.S. and in the previous versions of this model, the decisions were made after we had a census count of the ducks and also a habitat quality census. And the powers that be wanted to move the decision time before that. So what we had to do is base our decisions on lagged values rather than current values. Rather than this year's values, we based it on, because we didn't have those. The census was done, say, in May, and we wanted to make a decision in February. And what we actually augmented the state then with not only the lagged states, but also the lagged action. And that allowed us to get a prediction of what the current states would be. And we were basing our decision on that. So that was a case where the timing of the decision influenced what states we would have to include and what information was available to us at the time of the decision. Not quite the same idea, but it would be related to that.
Well,
That's actually the way that the mallard duck decisions are made today, is using that lag delayed model. So.
Well, that's interesting. So we're going to stop right now. Thank you, all of you tonight. And if you